Hello there. My name is Taya Graham, and welcome to the Police Accountability Report live stream. This is the part of our show where we don't just hold bad police accountable, but bring other important voices into the conversation to help us. It's also an opportunity to reveal to you in real time the so-called system that makes bad policing possible. And today, we have a special show for you with not just great guests, but some on-the-ground investigative reporting we've been doing over the past few weeks. A story we think is a telling example of how policing, inequality, and a lack of transparency all meet at the intersection at the corner of excessive punishment and often despair. But don't lose hope, because there are people who are fighting back. And I'm talking about activists, alternative journalists, and people who care about building a stronger community for all of us. But there is also a strong and vibrant collection of YouTubers and cop watchers who believe that your rights are worth fighting for. And that's why the theme of tonight's show is America becoming Cop City? That's why it's got a question mark, because within the struggle, there is hope, and we don't want you to forget that. But before I get to the gist of tonight's show, I want to introduce my reporting partner, Stephen Janis, who once again, despite my contention he belongs outside, has managed to work his way back into the studio. Stephen, welcome to the inside of TRNN Studios.
It's so amazing because I spend so little time in the studio that when I come in here, I kind of feel like I have to get to know everybody, introduce myself to the staff and some of our support staff. People work in the studio. They don't even know me. Yeah, they don't know who I am.
Didn't they ask you for ID?
Yeah, they did. They asked me for ID. They wouldn't let me in. I kept knocking on the door.
Did they let you stand on your rights?
It's ridiculous. How can people not know who I am? But anyway, I do appreciate it. You letting me back inside for a little bit. I hope the people that watch the show I need support. Tell them, please, post comments. Stephen.
Oh, Chris Topher said to let you inside. So you get one.
That's
if you get 20.
If I get 20?
If you get 20.
Can I stay inside tonight at least?
No.
Okay. Well, anyway, I am very happy and appreciative, and I'm appreciative that we have people.
Joe Black said kick him out.
What?
And so did Catman. Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay, well, I guess we know what's going to happen when the show's over.
The people have spoken.
Okay, so I'm just going to enjoy it while it lasts, and I do like it. So it's nice and warm in here, and I'm very appreciative. So thank you.
Uh-oh.
Thank you.
Oh, Katie Kane said he needs a name tag.
Oh my God. Is it that bad?
Just for next time.
Well,
oh my God. Otto says #outside Stephen. I love it. I love it.
Well, okay, great. All right. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
I hate Cajun Randy. So I just also want to add, before we get to tonight's report, that we are still in the middle of a fundraiser that has a specific goal, and that's making sure Stephen has what he needs to stay outside.
If you guys are going to kick me out, you're going to have to support me.
He's probably going to need an umbrella, tent, maybe a reusable water bottle. And he might need a microphone. So if you can, please hit the donate button below. You know we don't take corporate dollars or ads or money or from the government or any of the other institutions that we would hold accountable, which means we only answer to you, our audience. And of course, if you like a little bit of behind the scenes with me, you can go to our Patreon at Accountability Reports, because I always have a few extra treats there for my patrons. And at the end of this show, I will be thanking each and every patron, past and present, because we support you and appreciate your support, whether you can only give once or every month. So also, this show is very much live, so please be patient with us if we have any technical difficulties, and I will try to get your comments and questions on the screen as we go. Okay, now we've gotten that out of the way. So as you may or may not know, Stephen and I spent several days in Atlanta, Georgia to report on a story that has gotten a lot of attention, but we think has been somewhat misreported by the mainstream media, to say the least. It's a proposed police training center called Cop City, a plan to build a $90 million facility, and it's 380 acres, and it would train cops in urban combat, high-speed chases, how to rappel up and down the wall. I'm not kidding. David, can you put up a clip one of the Cop City map? Thank you. So as you can see on the map I'm showing you now, this training center is going to be expansive with classrooms, an auditorium for screenings, and housing for cops to stay in while they're on site to learn how to police us with even more aggressive tactics that certainly seem far removed from community-style policing. But beside the disturbing emphasis on militarized policing and punishment, it's how and why this plan came together and what it will mean for communities that surround it that is even more problematic. And that's why tonight, we are going to take you on a journey, so to speak, a trip down the path that has led us into a world where Cop City is not just possible, but probable. A place where the need for affordable housing, good jobs, and freedom from surveillance has been eclipsed by the American addiction to law enforcement. And of course, a prime example of why our national obsession with law enforcement can have and will continue to have unintended consequences, not just on the health of our community, but on the psyches of people as well. Stephen, can you share a little bit about how we'll be approaching this topic and how it's going to be a little bit different than the way our mainstream media friends are taking a look at it?
Well, because we're going to be critical of what I would like to call the core imperative of policing in this country, which is something important. It's important to make a distinction here, because in some ways we take a look at Cop City as an inevitability, like the fact that Cop City is just going to happen no matter what, that policing has to be constituted the way it is, no matter what happens. What we want to do is kind of declaw that and kind of unearth the actual imperatives that drive that, right? That the ideas of policing, the ideas of what policing means, of how it's supposed to function and how it often doesn't function, and how policing affects us in the way we think about what we deserve, like what kind of community we should have. Because when we're in Atlanta, as you'll talk about, we uncovered a lot of stuff about the way the community looks at itself and the way the community views Cop City that I think the mainstream media kind of misses in a lot of ways, because there's a power to policing that is unseen to a certain extent. It's a psychological power. And I think tonight, not just going through Cop City, but when we talk to our guests who have police channels, we will see that, because we see on the show, the one thing I think we want to talk to our guests about is how much pain policing generates in the community. How many people email us and how many people send us messages on Facebook, how many things we can't get to. And
it's actually really painful to see all those messages and not be able to help every single person that reaches out to us.
And there was a lot of verisimilitude between what we see with our channel and what we saw in Cop City in the way people were pained about what they were going to do to Atlanta. And they wanted to be heard, and they were not, or otherwise branded as terrorists, or otherwise branded as troublemakers. And I think that's really important to uncover that and to expose it and to say, look, this is painful for the people of Atlanta. And I think the two guests we have will be able to even elaborate on that more. So I think that's part of it. Yeah.
Well, to help us take this investigative excursion, we're also going to be joined by several guests who are on the front lines of this fight for a world where the people take priority over police and not the other way around. They are guests who have watched our show, and they have their own YouTube channels as well. Regular citizens who are fighting back for their rights and sharing their stories and what that means for all of us. So first, we'll be joined by a YouTuber who I am sure you all know. His name is LackLuster, and he has one of the most popular channels on YouTube that gets millions of views doing incredible coverage of police malfeasance. Then we'll be speaking to Chris Reiter, who also has a channel for public safety, and he was a guest on our show a few weeks ago. If you recall, we showed this video of a raid on Reiter's house that was not just illegal, but life-altering for him and Tiffany. And we will be talking to him about what he believes needs to be done to counter the overarching problem of policing, which he has witnessed firsthand. But first, I want to return to the theme of the show we discussed at the top. That is the deeper meaning of Cop City and the future it portends for both law enforcement and for us. So, one of the things I noticed when we arrived in Atlanta was a phenomena I have seen many times before as I've reported across the country. On the one hand, you have a city with gleaming towers and high-priced condos, and on the other hand, struggling neighborhoods that have obviously been neglected or even forgotten. But what struck me about this contrast was not just how stark it was, but also how this divide was represented in the very idea of Cop City, how the Atlanta business elite had pretty much rallied around the notion to spend $90 million on a training center while ignoring more pressing concerns raised by neglected communities in favor of this expansive plan to train cops, for lack of a better term, to be soldiers. Stephen, can you talk a little bit about what we saw and why we think Cop City is not just about a police training facility?
Yeah, we saw that, probably more illustrative than I've seen in any example, although there are a lot, that policing is sort of placed and situated in the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And it is a kind of a way to mitigate the effects of inequality. Because we saw in Atlanta, like you said, a shining city with beautiful condos for $700,000, and we saw neighborhoods neglected, and we saw basically a concrete palace, and they're going to tear down a forest. So, this sort of idea of Cop City is in some ways very similar to the idea of policing we see in many communities, both rural and urban. It is like sort of the wall between the people who have everything they need and the people who don't, but it becomes a psychological wall that changes the people who say, I don't want this, into people who are either troublemakers or don't matter. And I think you could just feel it in the activists in the way it was constituted, that this idea was only meant to further that. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on.
Stephen, that is such a good point.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that stood out to me is some of the companies that were mentioned.
Yeah.
There was Merrill Lynch, JP Morgan, Home Depot,
Coca-Cola,
Equifax, Wells Fargo. I mean, so many others. And their interest in helping build the Atlanta Police Training Facility, as well as putting up those surveillance cameras, seem particularly uniquely focused.
It's interesting because you have sort of here the capitulation of some sense in the way you have capitalism, some of the biggest names in capitalism, some of the biggest companies lined up on the one side secretly, and this is important, secretly funding this Cop City. And you have the other side, activists who don't have millions of dollars, who don't have high priced lawyers, who don't have the power and the levers to fight back. Kind of coming up, it was like sort of, David versus Goliath in this sense. But I think that's the point to a certain extent. The Atlanta Police Foundation sounds, in some ways, grand. Here's this big Atlanta Police Foundation funded to the max, millions of dollars flowing through it to build a training center, while the people who, really were activists who had deep passion but had to fight back against would be the pillars of capitalism and fighting over a police training center of all things that they say the city doesn't need, because this police training center is going to militarize police, make them less responsive to the community, and really gouge out a beautiful forest that they all think should be an amenity. So it really is amazing that you would have these corporate titans line up against activists and say, no way, no, one way or another, we're building Cop City, and one way or another, there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that's the stark divide we saw in Atlanta. And I think that applies to other communities as well.
Very well said. Now, before we delve into some of the more troubling details of how the plans for Cop City unfolded, it's important to note that the relationship between residents and the police department were already tense. Let's listen to Kamau Franklin from Community Movement Builders to explain the history a little bit.
So the relationship is not a great relationship because, for various reasons. Atlanta has a history, even though it has probably a majority black police force, of also using stop and frisk and police violence and violence against the community. And so the relationship is fraught. About now 3 years ago, Rashard Brooks, less than a mile from here, was killed at a Wendy's, which was part of the 2020 uprisings in which people here in Atlanta, as well as all across the country, took to the streets. And over 90%, I think it's approximately 90% of the arrests in Fulton County, which is the county that Atlanta is mostly situated in, over 90% of those arrests are of black people in Atlanta, even though Atlanta no longer makes up the majority of black residents in the city itself.
So also, Stephen, there was something we noticed, which was along with the fraught relations between police and the community, the mainstream media was advancing a narrative that was quite at odds with what we saw on the ground. But there was also a group that was trying to counter that narrative. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, with the Atlanta Press Collective, which is really just, one, I think, most beautiful things in terms of how journalism, despite the fact that the mainstream media has all the funding, the corporate advertising, that there are citizens who just say, no, we're going to tell this story in a different way. And let's remember that narratives are important. Narratives are extremely important to policing, because policing is in some ways a function of governmental narrative, saying that, there are failed communities and there are successful communities. And that's why, the people we spoke to, some of the on the ground journalists were working, literally just working for the passion of telling the community story is so important, because it shapes a narrative in a way that I think makes other things possible. It's a narrative that's posited against the idea of police narrative, which is, here's a community that doesn't deserve agency. Here's a community that doesn't deserve amenities. The only people that deserve to have power are the people who already have it. So, I think this was very, for me, inspiring.
Yeah. Now should we run that clip from the Atlanta Community Press Collective?
Yeah.
Let's give them a moment to share their thoughts. How they're interpreting these domestic terrorism charges.
So there are a few things about the mainstream media coverage. One, our paper of record, the AJC is owned by Cox Media. Cox Media is owned by Cox Enterprises. The chair of Cox Enterprises, Alan.
Now, that was Clark from the Atlanta Community Press Collective. Stephen, I know you were
Yeah.
impressed with that independent reporter.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, but he makes a great point that the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is owned by the Cox family, which the Cox family is also part of the funders of the Atlanta Police Foundation, which is funding Cop City. You know, so there you have the most powerful media institution in Atlanta, which also happens to be involved in Cop City.
Yeah.
So how can you expect objective coverage of this story from an institution that is intimately involved in its creation?
Oh, absolutely.
It's I think a little disturbing to say the least, but it's also, you know, a very normal fact of life in many U.S. cities where the mainstream media is intertwined with the institutions that people are trying to hold accountable. So I was really impressed with his breadth and scope of knowledge and his reporting.
And I also noted something that particular newspaper, what was it, the Atlanta Constitutional Journal? Is that
Atlanta Journal-Constitution,
Atlanta
yes.
Journal-Constitution. I had noticed when I was doing a little research on it that same day they had announced their first ever Black editor. This is in Atlanta, which has been a majority Black city, home of civil rights, and they literally just got their first Black person as an editor. Okay, not a great sign. Anyway, that is that. Let me take my reporter hat off for that one. Now, there was a key private group funding Cop City with dark money called the Atlanta Police Foundation. It is a nonprofit organization which is comprised of a board of economic elites that represent corporate America, to say the least. Executives from Fortune 500 companies like Delta Airlines, Coca-Cola, Chick-fil-A, Waffle House, Cox Enterprises, Home Depot, Merrill Lynch, Equifax, Delta Airlines. I could go on and on. It's literally a who's who of corporate Atlanta who are oddly committed to just funding police privately, but they also have a bit of an issue with transparency, I've noticed. And Stephen, what I've also found interesting is that this private police foundation is not only funding Cop City, but it also sponsors a city-wide surveillance system, which we learned is named after a developer. So let's listen to one of the activists, Micah Hershkin, describe what they are fighting against.
They were founded in the early 2000s, so they've been around for a couple decades now. And really, you know, they're supported by a bunch of different corporations, many Atlanta-based corporations. And really, they sort of, in a lot of ways, act as a shadow government in Atlanta. They have an immense amount of power and authority. I think people, you know, politicians and people who are, you know, trying to seek elected office know that in many cases, if you want sort of a career in politics in Atlanta, you're going to have to go through the Atlanta Police Foundation because they just have a lot of money and wield a lot of influence. They give a lot of funding to the cops. You know, they sort of channel this private money that is, of course, tax deferred into policing. They operate the city's Operation Shield network, which is this massive network of surveillance cameras that includes both city cameras and then also, you know, everyday people can hook up their security cameras into this feed. And so, you know, making Atlanta one of the most surveilled, you know, the most surveilled city in the country. Yeah. So through Operation Shield, you know, which is this sort of surveillance network, all of the footage from, you know, the city security cameras, individual security cameras that people can link up to the system is run through what is called the Loudermilk Video Integration Center, you know, of course, named after one of these rich Atlanta families, developer companies, you know, which even just right there sort of shows the connections of who is behind surveillance and policing in the city.
So, Stephen, I know you've done reporting on surveillance systems before in here and in Baltimore, but a private surveillance system named after a developer. How do you explain that?
Well, I found that very interesting because if you look at Atlanta, it's like a concrete testament to extreme wealth. And so it makes sense that the developer would also have the power to surveil privately the citizens of the city. And I think you can see parallels in cities like Baltimore, where we have done primarily two things: given tax breaks to developers and spent billions of dollars on policing. And those two things intersect in cities like Atlanta and cities like Baltimore, because development is one of the main economic engines. So for him to have actual control over the surveillance system is also almost Gotham-esque, you know, in a sense. Like we're in Gotham City now.
Very much so.
Right, because he's really literally, he owns the real estate and he pays to surveil the real estate. So it kind of gives you, it's a little weird and a little disturbing, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, when I was there and I learned about all the different like CEOs and executives and corporate elites, it really sounded very dystopian. I mean, it's like one of those futures you can imagine where we don't have countries anymore. We're owned by corporations, and the corporations control every aspect of the society. Like, it's really scary.
Well, to take the metaphor a little, you have this beautiful gleaming city, but underneath it is this private dystopian surveillance system that affects not the people who live in the $700,000 condos, but the people who live on the edge of what will be Cop City. They're the ones being surveilled, and the people controlling it are the people that own the building. So very, very illustrative of some of the problems with law enforcement.
So I want to share a little bit of the B-roll of the forest, just so people can see what they're fighting for. It's also worth noting, I think, that this battle is not just about a training center. It's also a fight to preserve a life-sustaining and unique forest that's supposed to provide recreation for Atlanta residents, particularly the communities that surround it. That's because Cop City will be built by tearing down what's known as the Weelaunee Forest. It's an old-growth, contiguous tract of land south of the city that is also known as one of the 4 lungs of Atlanta. The nature preserve is a stunning collection of the wildlife and freshwater streams and rivers that will be in part torn down and replaced with pavement and concrete so that police can practice car chases. It's also worth noting that this beautiful oasis of unfettered nature is next to working class communities and neighborhoods of color that have also suffered greatly at the hands of Atlanta police. We spoke to an activist, Reverend Keyanna Jones, who explained the significance of the land and why she was fighting to stop the plan to pave it over.
The city has never tried to upgrade that land. Neither DeKalb County nor the city of Atlanta has ever tried to do anything with that land to enhance it or make it better for the people. When they finally decide to pay attention, it's to take it away. There are people who started to create bike trails simply by biking there often enough. When they finally decided to start to build the walking path through there, walking, biking, I use it for roller skating because my daughter and I roller skate on that path that goes right into Weelaunee. That finally started to happen. The next thing you know, oh, we're going to go and take this away because you all have found a use for it. You've decided to use it despite the fact that it was an old prison farm and that you could get hurt over there because we haven't done any type of testing for chemicals in the soil or anything. The people start to use it more, and all of a sudden you want to take it away.
And what makes this even more concerning is how the criminal justice system is treating the activists, including forest defenders who've been fighting back against the plans to build it. That's because the Georgia Bureau of Investigation has charged several dozen people who were attending a concert and some who allegedly clashed with police last month with domestic terrorism. To do so, they have used a law passed after Dylan Roof massacred 9 innocent people in a South Carolina church in 2015, essentially equating the activists with a hate-filled, racially motivated murderer. Prosecutors have also hinted in court that they may bring RICO charges against the same group, citing specious evidence that the activists had written the number of an organization on their arm that provides bail to people that are helping protect their First Amendment rights, and they're using that as proof of a conspiracy. So we spoke to a representative of that group, Marlon of the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, and he said this could have a chilling effect on protesting across the country.
Absolutely. That's one of the most concerning things that we've seen. I mean, really, to paint the bigger picture, what we're seeing is a sustained and escalating campaign of repression against political protesters in this movement against Cop City. And we've seen police and prosecutors use an escalating series of tactics which are increasingly violent and increasingly illegal in an attempt to get protesters to stop their campaign and to scare members of the public into kind of disassociating with the campaign to create this chilling effect. And one of the most recent kind of strategies that we've seen prosecutors attempt is this idea of using RICO charges, which is a class of charge that's designed for prosecuting organized crime organizations like the mafia or violent gangs, and applying this rather to political activists.
So these RICO charges are really scary, and it's actually something that we saw potentially weaponized against cop watchers in Texas, like HBO Matt, Ismael Rincon, and some of the other folks there as well. So this use of excessive charges, stacking charges on people like that is really scary, don't you think?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it across many rural communities, cities as well. I've experienced it myself as a reporter, where they tried to, sweep me into a grand jury investigation when we were covering the firing of the first Black police chief of Pocomoke. It is a common tactic. It shows, how law enforcement has many tools to fight dissent, to fight people who fight back against, law enforcement. I think in this case, it's particularly scary because they were saying that these charges, if they're acquitted, could be 30 years. 30 years in prison, and I just find it astonishing that is even, and if they come forward with a RICO case, again, these could be massive sentences for people
horrifying.
Who were just protesting and clashed with police. And, even if you take the worst perspective on that, 30 years in prison, we just we dole out years like candy in this country. And I think it's reprehensible, really.
And just as a side note, so that people understand how dangerous this is. So the Solidarity Fund is an organization that you call if you're in jail because your First Amendment rights have been violated. You've gone to a protest, you held a sign, and you got taken away. So you wrote the number of the organization on your arm so that you could call and say, hey, I need bail fund help. And that could lead to you getting RICO charges. I mean, that's extreme. So that's why I'm letting you know what happens here in Cop City. Everyone has to pay attention to it, because if this kind of behavior, if these kind of charges are allowed to go ahead, if it can happen here in Cop City, they're going to try it at a city or town.
Well, that's
near
the point. I mean, that's what people are saying. This is like a template for repressing protests across the country. And there are other states that have passed laws like these that are very similar in Florida and other places. So it's definitely something that I think prosecutors are testing the waters.
Absolutely.
And that we'll probably see more of as people keep pushing back against over policing.
But of course, sometimes a picture can tell a story better than words, because when we visited the site where the alleged clash between protesters and police occurred, it became clear how corrosive the overemphasis on police in our country can be. What we witnessed was a testament to the power of the corporate elites over the lives and concerns of activists. Stephen, can you talk about what you said when we visited the site and how it affected you? Because I know I was deeply affected when I was standing there right next to the Woolani Forest by the site of La Tortugita's memorial.
Well, you saw, I think what made it saddest thing to me is you saw the left remains of a grassroots movement in the most essential way when you say something is grassroots, because literally people are out in nature trying to protect it, celebrate it, and celebrate the community that comes with it. And it seemed like, that place had turned into like sort of a semblance of a war zone. There were just remnants of things that had just been cleaned up and cleaned out. And you saw the real power of policing, the way it impacts the environment and thus impacts our minds, and it impacts the way we think about ourselves. Because you had this like campground and places where people have been talking and obviously joining in community. And, suddenly it had been like wiped, not clean, but left in a mess by police pushback. And of course, when we were there, we kept getting strafed by a police helicopter.
Right. When we were out there, I think not only did we have
6 or 7 times.
Not only do we have an unmarked police car sitting there with us, keeping an eye on us,
blocking our car in for a while.
Blocking our car in.
Yeah.
But a helicopter buzzed us while we were trying to do our little stand-up.
Yeah, I think straight is kind of like more buzzes. Yeah, I know.
Well, I don't think if we were straight,
I meant
here.
Psychologically strafing us. Okay, I'm sorry. That's pretty funny.
They buzzed us and dipped down 6 times, because apparently at least the two of us standing outside with a camera and a microphone was just.
So it shows the extremes, right? That we're talking about, the extreme imperative of American policing, that 2 people holding a microphone and a camera are suddenly a threat. If that's a threat, right? I don't know where we're headed from there.
Iowa Blackbird made an interesting comment. Smartphones are a tool of the surveillance state. How do you organize effectively over time without communication devices or supports? How can you live without a phone? The left has been trapped. That's an interesting.
Maybe Signal? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I was going to say, but that still means we are somewhat trapped by our devices. I think that's when we reach out to the wisdom of some of the older organizers, because they managed to organize, create unions, get together, push back, whether it was like Eugene Debs's crew back in the day, or Emma Goldman, or people pushing back against the Vietnam War back in the day. They managed to figure out a way to show up and protest and stay in contact with each other. So if they can do it, we can do it. We've just become a bit dependent on our devices, I would say.
Yeah.
But to me, and back to Cop City, but thank you. I just wanted to make sure that I address that comment, and I will try to address as many as I can for you. So one of the things that also stood out to us was the tribute to a young man who lost his life in that struggle. That was Manuel Tehran, or La Tortugita. Uh, La Tortugita was a forest defender and environmental activist who was shot by police as they used the same militarized police tactics that Cop City is designed to teach. Police alleged that Manuel had a gun and that he had fired on an officer prior to being shot. But an independent autopsy commissioned by his family shows he had defensive wounds on his hands and that he was in a so-called meditative position, his hands like this, with his legs crossed. Again, Reverend Keyanna talked about Manuel and how he believed in peaceful protest.
Because we know that Manny was a pacifist, that Manny was nonviolent, that Manny believed that the way we would win this fight to stop Cop City was through nonviolent action and persistence. And one thing that Manny always said was that we were going to win with our love, that our voices, because we could win in the court of public opinion, because we had the community on our side. So there is no way that we as a community who stood with Manny and stood in the forest and understand the magic that happens there that brings people together to fight for this cause, there's no way that Manny would have wanted to injure another soul because they were not violent. They knew that the way to win this is to present the facts like we have been and through the direct actions that we've been performing.
You know, Stephen, I was really struck by the attachment and love for the forest that La Tortugita was trying to defend. And in a sense, his and others' passion for the forest showed that they thought of it as a communal resource. And I think when you're in the forest, you really understand why Cop City is such an affront to people who believe the land should be preserved for everyone. I mean, Atlanta is a city replete with 4-lane thoroughfares and skyscrapers, but hardly any green spaces or parks. So you have this gusher of private money to secretly fund it. And then you have this beautiful forest, one of the last so-called nature corridors near the city that is literally going to be paved over to create safety for the rich, to ensure wealthy elites can continue to prosper. And let's remember, an old growth forest cannot be replaced. It cannot be raised from the dead after it's buried under steel and concrete. It is a precious and irreplaceable gift of nature, a unique site where the earth gives to us and which we should treasure. Okay, Stephen, I know I'm getting a little caught up, but that place was beautiful. And to think that it's going to be knocked down so that police can practice urban warfare or putting down protesters, I mean, that is horrifying.
You know, I think that's what makes Cop City so representative, some a multifaceted nature of police and sort of the repression it elicits. Because, you know, I think the people who tear down that forest are going to go in the annals of environmental, I would guess, not to call them villains, but historical villains in the fight to save this planet. You know, I was moved by being in the forest. And to me, to think, to tear it down, to have pavement so cops could chase each other around and take an irreplaceable, beautiful symbol of nature, I just really... I think that it's going to be historical in the sense that this will be seen as like a fulcrum through which we see the environmental disaster that's being, you know, being created by our, you know, sort of excess capitalism.
And, you know, Noli D made a really good point. She said that there's going to be more storms than ever. And that is something that we discovered talking to a variety of people there, that forest is absolutely essential to help prevent flooding. It's also essential to make sure that the area has clean, fresh air. I mean, it's called one of the 4 lungs of Atlanta. So this is a beautiful space that was originally promised to that community for recreation, to be used for biking and hiking and just enjoying the outdoors. And so it's being taken away, and that simply isn't fair. And for some reason, the community apparently doesn't have any say. There was a 17-hour hearing where members of the community weighed in, talked about how they felt about Cop City. Over 70% of the people who came to that hearing said, we don't want it. But apparently those city council members don't want to listen to their constituents.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, you see in this the real bifurcation that policing has on, you know, our concern about things that are really important to the community. You had the grassroots movement, but you have a wide swath of Atlanta that, because the mainstream media sort of blankets all this with the blessing of this neoliberal sort of fascism, that people say, oh, why do I care about Cop City? You know, I mean, the police want to train and want to repel and, you know, want to practice in a fake nightclub. What do I care? But I think everyone who's really supports Cop City should go out and spend a couple minutes in that forest and realize what they are trading for this pavement and these police training facilities. It is really depressing in many ways.
That's an excellent point. Well, we will have more to say about Cop City later on in the show and more in our ongoing reporting on policing in America. But now we're going to be joined by our first guest to discuss not just the troubling developments with policing we were just discussing, but also the state of law enforcement across the country. His name is probably familiar to anyone who cares about police accountability and probably some who don't. In fact, it is no exaggeration to say he has one of the most popular channels on YouTube, at least according to us, particularly when it comes to showing the impact of over-policing on everyday Americans. His name is, of course, LackLuster, and we are very lucky to be joined by him today. Welcome to the Police Accountability Report live stream.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Hey, LackLuster, how you doing?
Doing well. Thank you. Yeah, I almost had myself muted, but I saved it last second.
All good.
Yeah,
well, before we get to your work, I'm just curious if you would share some of your thoughts on Cop City.
To be honest, I have not been following the whole Cop City thing. I'm learning a lot about it tonight from you guys.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we could do our job as reporters.
I did want to ask you a question, just to start off about, something that we've seen in our channel, and I'm sure you see, is just the amount of people whose lives are really negatively affected by policing in this country.
Oh, yes.
Is this something you see? I mean, we're a little we get overwhelmed sometimes trying to reach out to all the people who need help. I can't imagine what you must see. What are you seeing as you continue to report on policing?
Well, I have a form that people can submit videos to, and that thing blows up all day. And then my email addresses are public, and it's gotten to a point, realistically, about 2 years ago, where I can't even respond to them. And half of them I have to kind of browse over as quickly as I can before I decide whether or not I'm even going to finish reading it, and it's a shame.
Yeah.
And I've tried hiring people to help me with it, and delegating those tasks out, but it's crazy. It's a never-ending story,
Right.
It's whack-a-mole, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, the story? I mean, I see so many people whose lives, to me, the story is a story of chaos in their lives. Like they get one interaction with law enforcement, and it seems to turn into something even worse over time, and sort of, not the word blossom, but just get worse and worse. But there's a lot of pain too, right? And when people reach out, because people reach out to us in pain, do you, not to get too emotional, but do you see that kind of stuff when you're going through these?
Yeah, all the time. Typically the subject line is "please help," and for a lot of people, it's an incident or a situation that is representative of the worst time of their life, whether it was losing someone to police violence or just getting caught up in the court system and having to deal with all of that. So yeah, there's quite a bit.
Something that I've dealt with, you do so much work reviewing cell phone and body camera footage, and I know we've both seen some absolute horror. But outside of that horror, there are certain laws that are being broken by these police officers. What are some of the most common abuses of police power that you see?
I think the most common thing that I see might not actually be them trying to be nefarious. I think the most common thing that I typically deal with is law enforcement that haven't been trained, I guess, to a level above mediocre.
That's very diplomatic.
Yeah, it's really simple stuff. But it's very interesting because a lot of these things are very simple concepts. When you think about what freedom is and what it would really be, what would freedom look like in a free society? Would we allow armed agents of the state to pull you over on the side of the road and pull everybody out of the vehicle in the name of officer safety. It just seems like there hasn't been enough thought, and the culture of policing becomes more overwhelming than the actual the legal basis, the legal foundation, the philosophy behind freedom. All of that kind of gets washed away because of the culture and the brotherhood that they have. And I understand why there's a brotherhood. I was in the military. I was, a firefighter with LA City Fire. And so I understand the camaraderie that comes with those jobs, and why it becomes kind of an us versus them, because it's experiences that you go through that nobody else experiences except for that specific class of people. But it becomes so strong that it erodes, I don't know, it seems like it erodes all common sense, to be honest. And that's kind of a shame.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's pretty profound. I mean,
It is.
because it seems, and I guess you see this a lot, that it seems like many times I watch videos where police could literally de-escalate, literally walk away, literally just say, you know what, I'm not going to deal with you today. I don't even care. And it seems that there's some sort of compulsion they have, that they have to resolve the situation in their favor, with their power being paramount. Do you see that? And why do you think that is? Is that part of the culture you're talking about?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it can be part of the culture, and an even bigger and maybe even more dangerous part, maybe not, is one's personal ego. These jobs typically attract type A personalities, people who are often very disagreeable, like to take charge and lead. Whether they're leading in the right or wrong direction, that's for you to decide. But that's the type of personality that we're seeing in these occupations. And because of that, when they feel slighted, or if they've lost control, if you make them look foolish, or maybe even if you're just a little smarter than them and they know it, you can see it kind of turn on people. For example, James Freeman put out a video today from Harvey Freebird, and the guy said, "Hey, you dropped your pocket. You dropped your pocket." And then the cop, it appears as though, I'm going to be careful with my language. It appears as though he felt embarrassed because he got trolled by this dumb joke, and found a reason to arrest the guy.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's obviously an ego issue,
How did you get from, serving your country in the military, being a firefighter, to having one of the most popular cop watching channels and being a journalist? Like, how did you make that transition? It's kind of fascinating to me, because you've been in both worlds. Like, Taya and I have only been journalists. We don't know what the other world's really like. How did you manage that? And what did you learn from that kind of transition?
Sure. Well, I think it goes back to my time in Iraq. I was a combat medic for 1st Infantry. So we were on the front lines, and we were sent all over the country to fight in these big battles. And because I'm a medic, I'm the one medic for 38 guys, and I'm very protected. I'm very cushioned. And so they don't often push me right to the front, So because of that, I started filming, and they're all over YouTube, all my videos and stuff. But I was filming, and that's how I figured out editing and my love for it. And after the military, did the fire department thing, and the editing and my joy for that kind of science fell off a little bit. And because of those occupations, I would say I was like probably one of the hardcore bootlickers, and no, really, I probably would have been today commenting.
Let's be honest.
No, absolutely. But it's that slogan you hear in our community, back the blue until it happens to you. I was a very pro police. We need it for society and blah blah blah, and I think there's probably still arguments for that. But I had a neighbor threatened to kill himself, said he had a gun. He emailed a bunch of people, and so I took it as a very literal threat, called the Colorado Springs Police Department. They responded. I let them into my house, into my backyard. Like, he smokes in the backyard over there. I'm trying to help my friend, and they end up raiding his house. It's like a really small raid, but that interaction, they were telling me to go back inside my house, even though I was like, 50 meters around the little corner of this cul-de-sac type street. And so I had my first face-to-face negative experience with law enforcement, and it was just his ego versus mine, and he was wrong. But and because of that editing history, I took all that video and I figured out how to do a FOIA request, because I've been watching James Freeman and Johnny 5-0. I found them kind of interesting. Wasn't really, totally out of the boot yet, but I put it up online and it blew up, and Johnny reached out to me and a bunch of people reached out to me, and from there it's been, it's still a learning experience. There's just so much to learn about this, whether you're a law enforcement officer or on the journalist side, or a lawyer or whatever. There's just so much. That's kind of been my progression.
Do you think the cops that day realized they launched the biggest cop watching channel in the country?
I kind of hope so.
do you think they've ever had to reconcile with that? But
I imagine, that video was quite a ruckus at the time. So I'm sure he knew about it then. And after that video went viral, we had the ACLU come down from Denver into Colorado Springs and host a meetup. My wife had put together this weekly event, and we would gather and talk about, odd topics. And so they came down and they actually presented one of his cases from 2 years prior that cost the city $200,000. So, but I'm sure they knew all of this kind of stuff was going on, and I don't know. The sad thing is I don't know what happened to the guy, whether he was reprimanded or what.
Well, it brings up an interesting point, because do you think that police are becoming cognizant of the fact that they're being watched more and being videotaped more, and that people like you are doing journalism and reporting on things that they do instead of just letting it, it can have just as much. Actually, when you think about you or James Freeman or a variety of other cop watchers, have a bigger audience than the mainstream media. Do you think cops are like, do they know Lackluster's on the case with me, and I better get back into that car and not arrest this person? Do you think there's any consciousness of what you have started and others have created?
Yeah, absolutely. And because of my role in the military and through the fire department, I still have contacts and friends in those capacities. And just today there was a conference. I think it's the SE, the Southeast. I don't know exactly what conference it was, but there were 13 different states sent their highest ranking to do this big police conference, and my name was brought up apparently. So
that's amazing.
That's awesome.
And actually, I'm sitting on a video where they're asking somebody that they're arresting, "Oh, do you watch Lackluster?" So, and that was from Florida. So I rarely go to Florida. So I know it's having an impact. And I think sometimes we actually see it in the actions of the officers on the street. And so there are definitely some interactions where you're like, whoa, this is going to go really bad. And then it doesn't. And it's quite surprising. And sometimes even hear some of these officers reciting case law on the spot. So, and because and I think we owe it all basically to the camera. I'm sure this has been going on for centuries, if not, what's bigger than a century, 1,000. I'm sure it's been since human and the need to, I guess, control people in society and keep them in line. I'm sure it's been going on for that long, but now we get to actually see it, like looking into a crystal ball and seeing the past, and get to have some retrospect on actions that we wouldn't have been able to do 50, 60 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy.
It's interesting. I was sort of looking into I guess you could say the history of cop watching, because you're right. It's a very recent phenomena. And one of the earliest cop watching I could find was essentially from the Black Panthers in California, initially starting to record the actions of police. They started taking notes to see how the police were interacting with the community. And then later in the 1990s, there was an officer named Don Jackson, who later changed his name to Diop Kamau, and he started an organization called policeabuse.org. And he was an LAPD officer, and he eventually said, I cannot work with these cops. This is a corrupt organization. And he started filming police himself. And there are a couple, you can find a couple of the old YouTube videos of NBC taking his video footage of him, kind of setting up a police officer to see their negligent and even abusive behavior and turned it over. So there is a bit of a history of cop watching, but it was absolutely made possible by the camera, the cell phone. It really, we couldn't do it otherwise.
And then you have Tom Zebra, who is actually he
has VHS tape
in his trunk,
which is amazing.
I mean, Thomas showed me some of that video, and it's epic.
It really is
epic. I mean, but as you point out, it's evolved, and I mean, it seems like, as we were talking about before, that your work is, what's amazing is your work is having an impact.
Absolutely.
I think. And I am not surprised cops are invoking your name.
Oh yes.
Because I mean, I don't know if I'd want to be the subject of a 3 million view video. What do you think? What do you think is happening with American policing now? Is it getting worse, better? You touched on this a little bit, but I think we look at Cop City, it seems like it's just going forward with the same sort of militarized. Is it becoming more militarized? Are we getting closer to what you are familiar with, the military? And what are the dangers of that in your mind, having served in the military?
Yeah, I think my view on it changes every day. Like some days I'm like, oh wow, look at that. That looks nice. Maybe there's hope. And then the next day you see something that you never thought you'd ever see, or you think you've seen it all until this one video, and that tends to happen every other day too.
Wow.
But as far as whether it's getting worse or better, as far as if we play the numbers game and look at the history of SWAT and the militarization of police, I think it's getting worse. It's hard to say for sure 100%, because it could just be that cameras have become so prolific that now we're actually being exposed to it, rather than just not believing the crazy guy over there that says his house was raided. Yeah, right. Now we actually see it, and it's televised not only by the victims, but also by these agencies, and now people like Sheriff Mark Lamb, who are now capitalizing off of the no-knock raids and their special weapons and tactics teams. But if we look back into the history of it, where SWAT was essentially started to raid the Black Panthers, and then it was televised. People loved it. They created a TV show, and we had this national hysteria. And then by the mid 70s, you got maybe 500 SWAT teams across the nation. And today, just about every department has one. It's not sweeping across the board yet. You do see some smaller departments reaching out to their neighboring departments for joint operations and pulling in their SWAT teams. But those numbers have grown so much, and even the amount of no-knock raids because of nonviolent drug offenses, mind you, those have grown from maybe 150 per year back in the early 70s, and now we're looking at maybe around 100,000 per year in current estimations for now.
You know what? I just want to ask you one last question, because we do have one more special guest hiding back there. So just tell me, I'm just curious. Tell me a little bit just about some of the obstacles you have faced with records requests or transparency in
it's a
police
good
departments,
question.
because I know we have had our fair share, and sometimes nothing short of damning video evidence will get police or prosecutors to respond. How do you manage to get comment? How do you manage to get records?
That's a great question,
how do you put the full impact of the Lackluster channel to be able to get the response you need?
I haven't used the weight of the channel at all yet. For not for records requests or to like, if you don't do this, you're gonna end up on my channel. I haven't done that yet.
You're saving it.
Yeah, I don't know. I might not ever do it. I don't feel very comfortable with it. I know I hold a huge power, and it's somewhat scary. Like I obviously work for it, but I didn't necessarily ask for it, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah.
And I want to be very careful with it, because I know that it could damage the entire movement. Something stupid that I do. I mean, I could say something wrong on this podcast and have my door kicked in tonight, and then there goes my family and whatever else.
Yeah.
So, but as far as like records requests and jumping through hoops, probably nothing too crazy. I get a lot of a lot of really uptight records clerks that don't like that I write out my records requests. Like, I have a huge template that I'll typically go through and cite the laws and of their state and whatnot, and they'll say, no, you have to use our form, or which is like less information is going on your form. But yeah, I think the hardest thing I really have to deal with is there are some states that don't allow you to request records unless you're a resident. Some of those do have like a journalism caveat, and if you say like, hey, I'm media, then they'll pump it out. But yeah, like Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so those are kind of difficult, but people reach out and help. So
I do like it's great that you called it a movement, because I really do, Taya and I really believe covering, you and James Freeman and Otto the Watchdog and
Blind Justice,
Eric Brandt, you go on and on.
Monkey 83,
Yeah,
and
that
Tom
it is
Zebra,
a movement.
Shark,
It really is a
Highway
movement.
Productions.
I mean, and that's pretty. What's really cool is it's completely organic.
Yeah,
it's not something contrived out of a corporate, giant's mind. Here, let's spend some more opiate to the masses. It's really something that people just on their own, like you, have invented.
Yes.
Right. That's amazing. Like, to me, that's amazing. And as a journalist who came from the mainstream media, I love watching how you guys are creatively approaching this and changing the fiber of journalism as you go. I just think that's awesome. So I just wanted to say that. So that's a compliment for me.
It's really neat. Well, thank you very much for that. There's certainly a lot of passion behind this, because of the way that it affects us and how many people it affects, how much money it takes from us, and how much of it is unaccounted for, how much of that is unaccounted for. So I guess if I could say anything, it's just like, to everybody, just be very careful. I know that very passionate things tend to incite very fiery emotions, and anger can lead you down some dark paths. Whether you do anything with it or not, it's going to affect you pretty negatively. So I don't know, try doing something with it that is helpful and won't hurt anybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dale, for joining us. We really appreciate it so much. Thank you for taking the time to be here.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you
Of course.
for the work
Thanks for
you
having
do.
me.
And we just appreciate
we
you
really
so
appreciate
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
And I
guys.
just want to say, Otto the Watchdog said something great. According to Washington Post, police cost $1.5 billion in lawsuits. They are defunding themselves.
I love it.
Well said.
Thank you,
well
Otto.
said, Otto.
Yeah, it's not really a live stream without Otto the Watchdog.
It really isn't.
Love
It really
Otto.
isn't.
So
So I think we should probably go to our next guest. Chris Reiter, whose channel is For Public Safety. And just before I go, I just want to say, you guys know who Dale is. You know the Lackluster channel. But if you haven't gone there and subscribed, you might want to go and check it out.
Yep.
But you might want
I
to
know
take a
I know
look.
I watch it. So
yes, we do.
Highly recommended.
So it's under the name Lackluster, in case you didn't know. Now, Chris Reiter has a channel For Public Safety, and our next guest should be familiar to anyone who watches our show, because we reported on an illegal raid conducted by the police on his home in 2021 that led to devastating consequences for him and his family. But we also told an inspiring story about him too, because Chris didn't just suffer in silence after the police violated his rights. Instead, he fought back, even helping a victim of police brutality to file a complaint, which unfortunately, again, led to Chris being falsely arrested. But that is just the beginning of his story. And to help me tell the rest of it, I'm joined by Chris Reiter. Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Taya. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, we're so
thank you
glad
for
to
your
have you back.
patience.
And thank you for being patient with us.
I have been arrested.
So
oh, no, it's my pleasure. I've been watching and I'm learning a lot.
Well, it's a pleasure to have
with Chris's sound, but we'll try to push through it.
Yeah, we're going to push through because we really want you to be a part of the stream. So I know
first of all, I want to say,
had a question for you.
Let me ask you a question because to me it seems like Chris, you're living in let's say Cobb County. And I just
Cobb County.
Wanted to get your impression, your thoughts about Cobb City, what you think about it. Do you think it should go through? What are your thoughts on Cobb City?
Oh, I absolutely do not like the idea at all. The farther I've gone into learning, being proactive after what happened, I realized that a military style policing is also the same as the privatized style policing. They're the same. And when you get a privatized policing, then we as the influencers lose that ability. Because when they go privatized, we're no longer in control.
That's a really good point. I mean, and you've had firsthand experience with this because you had a SWAT raid on your house. And what I thought was amazing about your story and still continues to affect me is the fact that a lot of this was cops trying to turn policing into entertainment for, sort of like a Roman circus kind of thing. Can you talk about how, because we don't get to talk to many people who've experienced a police raid. How has that raid affected you now and then and your life on a daily basis, I guess I would say?
Oh, it's such a big question. It has such a large answer. I guess the best way to put it is completely life altering. I mean, I can't imagine that there's a small way to invade someone's life with a SWAT raid. It's going to affect them on a devastating level, no matter how it turned out. It's going to devastate their lives.
Yeah, it's interesting because when we were researching your story, I looked at some of the stats on raids. There are like 37,000 raids a year. Only 7% are for what SWAT teams were designed for, which is was supposedly hostage type situations. And so doesn't that kind of mind-boggling that there are about 35,000 people a year who are put in the position you're in, where someone raids over, there's a police raid over something minor? I mean, how does that strike you in terms of thinking about it on the scale of what your experience being multiplied thousands of times?
Well, I mean, it could have been way worse for us, and that's the thing is that everybody who's experienced it is in the position to say, well, it could have been worse because it can keep getting worse and worse and worse. So, it's at the level of everyone died. And it's just as dangerous on the side of the police too. There is no safety involved in these raids, and their militant style training does not keep that environment safe. It makes it more designed to attack. It's designed for safety. So when these police are learning these military tactics, they're going to come in hot. They're there to attack. And I think you and Taya hit the nail on the head segment that you did with Tiffany and I when you said we are trained with these tools. When these tools are in the toolbox, you know, they're looking, they're chomping at the bit for an opportunity. And when they get in from a military style, it is not good or one.
Yeah, no, you make a good point. We talked about, you know, the example of Chekhov's gun, which is Anton Chekhov was a Russian playwright who said, you know, don't put a gun in the first act if you're not going to fire it in the second act. Don't everyone email me how wrong that is. It's just a summary of that. But the point was that if you design policing, if you give police this tool, they're invariably going to want to use it. And I think a lot of times they like to dress up and play army, so to speak, and really, you know, it's stunning that this country, that we tolerate it, because if indeed 93% of these raids are for things like marijuana in the basement, you know, the risk, as you point out, the risk and the massive risk to the people on both sides of that door are I don't see how we justify it. I mean, as someone who's lived through it, is there any way to justify this kind of use of policing as like military raiders?
Circumstances, it would be a very, very rare standard that level of exercising. But
we're getting a little bit of lag.
Straight.
Yeah, it's getting worse.
School shootings, I can see in like that, you know, or like you said, Stephen, hostage situations. I mean, I get it. But since we're funding much support to so many agencies, agencies are developing, investing in their SWAT teams, and these areas very ever actually use them or be used. So they'll use them in circumstances not necessary.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chris, we're having a little trouble with your audio, and
we're having just a little bit of a lag, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I'm so sorry.
So maybe what we'll do is we'll just you know, have you back maybe next time.
You know what? We're just gonna have to have you back on.
Yeah,
that's all there is to it.
You're too good a guest. I don't want to do this interview when your internet's not working. And
because we are always hanging on every word. Okay, we want to hear you. We know people want to hear you. We've seen a lot of beautiful shout outs to you, to the For Public Safety channel. I think I even might have seen someone mention Tiffany's channel. I think that's official misconduct. So I know there are a lot of people who want to see you, who want to hear what you have to say, but unfortunately we are having a little trouble.
And I mean, the thing is, you know, people, you can go to our YouTube channel, to the Real News Network, and look on the Police Accountability Report playlist, and you can see we did a 40-minute interview with Chris and Tiffany.
We did a beautiful 40-minute
where we
interview
went through his case, and
step by step.
So Chris, we will have you back on.
We promise we'll have you back. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Will you come back and spend some time with us?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
All right.
Well, I think, Stephen, if there is one thing about Chris' story, especially I think the for-profit aspect of the raid, the way it deeply impacted his life and Tiffany's life. I mean, it illustrates how the people who watch us, we live in two distinct realities from the people who have what we would call the instruments of real power. Like there's the YouTubers and the cop watchers and the independent journalists, and then those who have the real power, the real elites. Well, and as we said before, there are those who are policed and those who aren't. And we've talked about this quite a bit. And I was wondering if you can break down what it means. Like, why is it so relevant?
Okay, so I think economic inequality creates excess power, right? It's almost like, you know, you have a cup that's too full. So what do you do with it? You don't want it to spill, right? You got to do something with that power. And I think police kind of absorb that excess power and use it to, you know, against the people who aren't on that side, let's say, so to say, the side we talk about of the elites and the people who have the power. So it's kind of like this excess power gets spilled out into the population, works its way into communities, and becomes the confrontation you see with police, where the cop just won't let someone go because they have to arrest them, or it becomes the 30,000 raids that are completely unnecessary over small amounts of marijuana. There is just a certain amount of excess power that capitalism, but mostly inequality. Like, let's not even call it capitalism. Let's call it rampant inequality creates, and that excess power has to go somewhere, and police are usually the recipient. That's why, we have the Cop City plan, because it's really just a matter of excess power finding a place in a community that doesn't want it, doesn't need it, and is trying to fight back against it, but it has to go somewhere, and I think so that's why when we talk about policing, we have to understand that policing is not just guns and badges and arrests and prisons. It's also an idea, right? It's an idea about something, about a way to solve a problem. It's an idea about how, the government has agency, not just against us, but a way to infiltrate communities in ways that are, I think, not productive at all. So it's really, really something that we have to look in the sense and say, what are we going to do about this excess power? How do we confront it? One of the things I liked about what LackLuster said was he said, there's a movement here. And I think what's really important to understand is that cop watching wouldn't exist if this excess power didn't exist.
Well
Those two
said.
things would not be here if we didn't have the excess power to deal with. So, I mean, what's beautiful about it, and we talked about at the beginning of the show about hope, what's beautiful about it is that this activist community has emerged. These YouTube channels have been created. This is all extremely important, because really without it, I don't think the mainstream media would approach this subject the way someone like Lackluster or a channel like James Freeman or Otto or anyone has approached this. I think that's what's great about it. It's been wholly creative, it's been innovative, and it's given us, in a sense, a different way of looking at the problem. Just like when we were down in Cop City and we said, the way this is being reported on, it's not bad, but it certainly isn't getting the essence of the imbalance of power in this case, or the excess power that sort of spills over, and suddenly you have a phone nightclub and a forest coming down and all sorts of other things that seem to have nothing to do with building a stronger community for people or taking care of their problems. I mean, I think personally that one of the most optimistic things there are people who care enough to create a YouTube channel. It's really stunning to me when you think about people who have done this, starting from nothing, with no funding, no way to pay themselves, no way to support journalism the way journalism is usually constructed around a business model. This was an organic model, not a business model. This is a model of passion. And, if you look at someone like Lackluster, who served in the military, served his country, and now is serving his country as an independent journalist, well, that gives me optimism, because that excess power, as much as it wreaks havoc in the lives of the people we talk to, the people who contact us, the people who have been victimized by policing, as much as we have to deal with it, this response has emerged wholly, fully, independently. And therefore, I think it's much more vital. Just like we saw in Atlanta with the community like the Atlanta Press Collective and the bail people and the activists who were fighting. They were doing this all on their own. They weren't funded. They weren't sponsored by Coca-Cola. Right. That's for sure, right? I mean, Coca-Cola they weren't walking around with Coca-Cola t-shirts or, Delta Airlines t-shirts. These people were doing this out of a passion. And that is the most potent force that can counter that excess power, which is the love and passion of a community who do something on principle, right?
Yes.
Because they believe constitutional rights and productive communities and fair housing are important. That's why, right? That's why, this, I think overall, I don't want to make predictions. I'm not better, but I think this independent movement will triumph because of the fact that it's completely organic and divided from that power and not participating in it. Because really, in a way, that power infiltrates all facets. And I know, because as a former mainstream media refugee, I know, as I say it, I know it's an old dad joke, but I say it, but I mean it, that, I've seen the difference. I've been on both sides, and I see the difference, right?
I think you're so right, Stephen, and I think that was so well said. I think it shows a truly democratic impulse, because Lackluster isn't the only person who was a part of that culture. I think we spoke to James Madison, who I think was a former police officer. I think Jack Turner was involved in corrections. Some of these folks were on the other side of this. They were embraced by that culture, and they saw the wrong that is occurring. We have a lot of folks that are auditors and cop watchers that are veterans who have so much respect for
Blind
the
Justice being a veteran.
Blind Justice.
Kyle
Kyle Monk 83.
Yep.
And they have so much respect for the Constitution and what America is supposed to be that when they see that being violated, they felt they had to do something.
Yeah.
So it's a really powerful movement. And I'm so glad that even if in a small way, we're able to show it and give it some light that the mainstream media simply refuses to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's our role. That's why we exist. I think that's why we should keep doing this. And I think that's why we're going to keep covering it.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can guarantee you that we're going to cover cop watchers no matter what happens. It's always going to be part of our show. And,
Absolutely.
and I learn something from them every day. So, I mean,
well.
just talking to LackLuster was extremely insightful. And also Chris Reiter. I mean, I really want to get him back because he is a man who is completely committed. You know, the part of the story we didn't get to tell that we've told before is that he experienced a raid, but after the raid, he went out and helped someone try to file a records request because their son had been a victim of a police brutal arrest. And he gets arrested again.
I know.
With a fake, name from a 1999 charge.
Was a 1998 charge for a joint.
Yeah, for possession of marijuana.
Yes.
Which tells you all you need to know about
him. Which wasn't him.
Which tells you all you need to know about American policing, because even in that small, simple arrest, you see the essence of the excess power spilling over and sweeping away another person in a way that's completely unnecessary. So, I think we can take that to the bank.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to share some final thoughts for tonight, and not just about Cop City, but the theme of this show is America becoming Cop City? And I know on the surface, it might seem like an simplification of a country as complex as ours. I mean, even setting aside for a moment the fact that we incarcerate more people than any country in the world, I think it's safe to say that what's going on in Atlanta is indicative of something about America that goes beyond a training facility, some asphalts and cops rappelling down buildings. I mean, if there is one thing I witness covering law enforcement, is that over-policing is not limited to big cities. In fact, it's safe to say anyone who watches our show knows that both rural communities and urban centers often suffer from the same sense of overreach that is a common problem with cops anywhere you look. But there's something specific that the Cop City controversy makes clear that needs to be acknowledged. Something about how the lines have been drawn between the community and the powers that be, which reveals how policing not just affects us, but in the worst sense, it defines us. Because spending time in Atlanta and witnessing the great wealth and abundance on one hand, and the great needs and neglect on the other, I was struck by how the largesse for the few does engender fairness for the rest of us. In fact, it's quite the opposite. What Cop City seems to represent is a particular form of American cruelty that in a certain sense surrounds us, but is often not recognized for what it truly is. All right, what am I saying here? Well, when you really drill down into all the stories we've explored tonight, when you truly take the time to fathom how policing works its way through so many facets of our society, it truly becomes something beyond the realm of making arrests, writing traffic tickets, or fighting crime. What you see instead is a different type of power that deeply impacts how we see ourselves. It makes possible the world where cops can storm into your house without cause, or as in the case of Chris, or plow over an old growth forest, despite the community voicing clear and just arguments against it. Well, to explain it, I'm going to use a metaphor likening the police power on display in Atlanta and elsewhere as a funhouse mirror, so to speak. The type that of reflection that distorts or contorts your appearance to make you either look garish or exaggeratedly thin or otherwise alien to yourself and others. It's something that is a relic of another era, but I think can be applied to the debate over policing today. So let's imagine what the Cop City conversation might be if the so-called fun house mirror policing did not distort our perspective of what's important and what is not. Because without police partisans and the mainstream media always positing cops as the thin blue line between chaos and civilization, maybe the whole debate over Cop City would just seem absurd. Maybe without the distortion lens of law enforcement, the Atlanta Police Foundation would not be funneling millions of dollars into a faux nightclub. Why? Because it would look ridiculous in a city with an affordable housing crisis so acute that rents are rising faster than people's incomes. Maybe paving over an old growth forest so cops can chase each other around would be insulting to the people who care about the futures of all neighborhoods, not just the rich, because their demands for a better world to live in would not be disqualified by that same Leo lens. Maybe any discussion of pumping $90 million so police can dress up in SWAT gear would seem ridiculous if at the same time gentrification wasn't forcing generational families out of Atlanta so developers could build more condos for the rich. And maybe without the funhouse mirror effect, the activists who fought back against the very idea of Cop City would not be facing a 30-year sentence for engaging in dissent, and prosecutors would not be talking about RICO charges against people for having a number to call when they need bail written on their arms. Because the only way any of this makes sense is if police, not us, define both who we are and our political agency. My point is that the preponderance of policing only helps to justify all the unjust ideas I reiterated. Without the funhouse mirror of law enforcement, the fair and equitable demands of a community could not be distorted into terrorism or a conspiracy or some other misleading fiction police create. And I mean fiction with a capital F, because that's what those charges are. I think what I'm trying to say here is something that the famous French philosopher Albert Camus pointed out decades ago, that the more unequal a relationship is, the more cruel the oppressor must become. And when the demands of the police for a special training center can turn the pushback from residents into organized crime and lead the leveling of a historic forest, well, I mean, what else can you call it but the cruelest punishment there is? Let's just remember that when we talk about a proposal like Cop City, we are not just talking about steel and pavement. We're not just talking about a story. Let's keep in mind that this story starts with a single and significant narrative, the voices of the community that will have to live with it and don't have the right to say no. They don't have the right to protest. They don't have the agency to dissent. They don't have the right to exist in opposition to policing. They are not citizens of a democracy endowed with inalienable rights. They are simply troublemakers, defined, charged, and otherwise disposed by the powerful mirror of American policing. That's why if there is one takeaway from this whole idea of police power, both in Atlanta and beyond, it's that the psychology of policing infiltrates how we think about ourselves. It defines the parameters of the debate, and it codifies the neglect, the hubris, and the general anti-democratic ethos that has defined the drive to build Cop City and the growth of over-policing across the country. So back to the question at the top of the show, is America becoming Cop City? Well, I think that's up to us, and let's make sure it doesn't happen. Or just listen to the words of a resident of Atlanta named Aaron Thorpe, who spoke to us on this very topic.
Cop City, I've been saying this, Cop City is a dark harbinger of the future to come. As I was saying, the state's only response, right, is to crack down, right, with the armed dogs of capital, right, which is the police. And, you know, it doesn't matter whether you live in Atlanta, right? It doesn't matter whether, you know, you're, you know, white. It doesn't matter. I mean, I guess if, like, you know, you're of richer class, you have political and economic, right, reasons why you wouldn't. But at the end of the day, right, like, Cop City is the only response, right, that they have.
I think that was well said, and thank you for letting me get that off my chest. So I do have a few shout outs. First to the folks behind the scenes helping to make this possible, Kayla Rivera and David Hebden.
Thank you very much, David and Kayla.
And thank you.
You guys did a great job.
Yes, and thank you, Noli D and Lacey R.
Yep.
We appreciate your help and
Lacey
support tonight. And I have to thank the folks of the city of Atlanta who were kind enough to speak with us and make time for us. And I'm going to say hi to my Aunt Mary and Margaret Ann, who I got to spend some time with. Hi, Aunt Mary. Hi, Margaret Ann. And hi, Kelly McAdams, who we got to see in Georgia, a talented person who we miss.
Yes, we miss Kelly very much.
And now for a big thank you to our Patreons. And if you have ever been a patron, past or present, I'm going to thank you, because the fact that you reached out to us means the world, and we will always appreciate you. Especially PAR associate producers David K, John E.R, Lewis P, Chris R, and PAR super friends Matter of Rights, Shane Bushta, and Pineapple Girl. Okay, so now here's the big list. Shannon Park. I'm not going to do the last names because you guys never tell me if I can use your full last names, even though you give them to me. So I'm going to only do an initial because I want to protect your privacy. So if you do want the full names, you guys have to tell me. Okay. And just again, the Patreon is accountability reports. So we appreciate your support because it helps it make it possible for us to do things like go to Atlanta. Yeah. So thank you.
For me to have a tent.
Or for Stephen to get his tent and reusable water bottle.
Yeah.
Okay, now back to our patrons: Shannon P, Cameron J, Matter of Rights, Farmer Jane USA, Joseph P, Marvin G, Kimmy Cat P, Devil, Nope, Kurt A, Patty, Angela True T, David K, Social Nationalist, David B, Marsha E, John E.R, Daniel W, Zira M, Louis, William T G, DB. Okay, DB McCrae, because the first part is initials. Okay, Susanth, Kemi, John K, Chris R, XXXX, Potshot, Kenneth Lawrence K, Stephen B, Blibbits, Cindy K, Dante Kipke S, Seskel S, John M, Pineapple Girl, Keith Bernard M, Joe 6, Six Estate AZ, John M, Gary T, Janet K, Rhyme P, Mark William L, Noli D, Kyle R, Guy B, Shane Bushta, Calvin M, Stephen D, Ron F, Alan J, Trey P, Julius Geezer, Omar O, Umesh H, John P, Ryan, Lacey R, Rod B, Douglas P, Andrea J.O., RBMH, Siggy Young, Stephen J., Michael Stephen L., Default Urine, Celeste D.S., P.T., Just My 2 Cents, Talia B., Peter J., Sean B., K.A., Joel A., Tim R., Larry L., Ronald H., Tamara A., Artemis L.A., John K., Dante K.S., Jimmy Touchdown, TrueTube Live, Kenny G., East Circle of the Quantum Note, Brian M, Byron M, Felonious P, Loretta S, Mike K, and Mike K. Thank you all for being awesome patrons.
Wait, did you say nope?
Nope. Yes.
Nope.
Nope. Yes.
Nope.
Nope.
Nope. What?
Yes.
Okay.
We have some very creative folks.
Yes, I would say very much very creative.
And I just have to say, I appreciate everyone who stuck around for the live stream tonight. We had, a few moments of technical difficulties, but you were kind to me. You were patient with me, and I want you to know how much we appreciate you. And I just want to say, although Stephen will be going outdoors.
I will?
Yes.
Really?
Very soon.
I don't think so.
Look, I told them that if you got 20, Stephen should stay inside. You would get to stay inside. The people have spoken because they only 3 people said you should stay inside.
Are you kidding me?
Yep.
What?
Yep.
All the work I did tonight, I don't get to stay inside.
You know what the thing is? They know that you're a man of the streets, that you're a hard-nosed investigative reporter, and you need to be out there getting the story, working hard. Okay.
Walking around City Hall for 24 hours, that really gets a lot of stories.
Look, you're the one who told me how much you learned beating the streets of Baltimore City,
That's
right?
true. Okay. All right. Fair enough.
You got to give the people what they want, Stephen.
Yes, you do. Okay.
All right. And on that note, I just want to tell you all, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And as always, be safe out there.